Hey everybody, this is your author Jeremy Watkins here with the reflection for chapter 2 called I Am. Basically, just an overview of the chapter talks about how we create this false security of denial and basically disregard all the details in our life that we've experienced. I mean, just from traumatic events or details of life that really caused us to corrupt the natural person that we are in order for us to hold on to a more stable idea of an identity instead of the actual real us. So now when we look into the reflection of ourselves and really look into the contents of our heart, we really don't see wholeness. We see fragmented places, we see divided places, and we see portions of ourselves that are so incomplete. And we always wonder, how could we ever go back and fill in those details? And so basically this interpretation of this reflection basically is knowing what God's response would be. What would he ask you in this situation? And when he looks into the center of your heart and looks into the core of your being, what is he really after? What does he really want to pursue in those missing places? And so I think every single day God asks us, you know, if we were to look into a mirror, he would say, what do you see? And if he was to show us the contents of our heart, I believe he would ask us, what do you really see inside? I mean, what is it that you think was there the entire time? Because I want to know what you see so that way I can tell you what I see. And I think that's the biggest thing when it comes to trying to understand a responsible creator, one who claims a higher standard of holding on to us as his created loved thing. And yet we see our faults, we see our errors, we see the things that we introduced into our world, the sin and all the oppression and just the tragic life events that came out of us and not God. It wasn't a part of his plan. And now when we see God as this responsible one, now we can see him as one who claims his identity inside of us. And the one thing that we do is whenever we have an interaction with this perception of God, the first thing that we think of is perfection. When we think of anything with the title of God or the personality of God or the nature of God, we always say, how could I compare or relate to something that is everything that I'm not? And I think that's our biggest misperception when it comes to who God truly is and his real heart for him who has created us. Because the first thing that happens is that whenever we get before something that's greater than us, the first thing that we do is look at what we're missing instead of looking at what we are. And I think that's our biggest downfall when it comes to really identifying the true self inside of us. Is that instead of focusing on what we have, we're always looking at what we don't. And so in order to fill that place, we find security in temporal things in order to say, well, this will suffice for this season. And the thing is that when it comes to identity, that if you are not defined by the thing that made you, then everything that you define yourself with is always going to fade because it's not eternal. The only thing that has an eternal stance or an eternal consistent position in your life is God himself, because we are forever attached and imprinted by his hands because we were made from them. And so until the moment that we can be honest about the facades that we put on to try to fill in those missing places is the moment where we can really come to encounter what God has really created us to be. And I think what happens is what God loves to do with us is he loves to isolate us. God loves to isolate us. He loves to have that one-on-one experience where it's just you and him, and there's no other sources or no other voices around that you could rely on to say, God, I don't think that's you. God loves to prove his introduction. He loves to introduce himself. He loves to rendezvous and to do a meet and greet with his created people. And the one thing I love about that is whenever God shows up in a place where it's only just him and I, what he does is he asks us questions. And the first thing God does is he calls us by name. But the weird thing is that we're so used to hearing our name whenever we're familiar with where it comes from, that when God calls our name, it's hard for us to respond because when he calls it, he speaks from a perfect place. And so if he was to say your name twice, You wouldn't even want to respond to it because he's calling to the perfection that he's placed inside of you. So the first thing that you do in the presence of God and when he begins to introduce himself is to shy away from him because you realize that you're not him. You realize that you're not perfect. You realize that you're flawed. You realize that there's something incomplete inside of you. But that's the very thing that God is after. He's after the misconception of you because you have yet to identify who he is. And that's the beautiful part of building the understanding of who God is through his point of view. I think when we see God, we automatically have this mirror, and when we're looking at him and he's looking back at us, the first thing we begin to realize is how different we may look to him. And so we do this compare and contrast, and what it does is it segregates us from the very thing that we belong to. And I think if we were to ask God what he sees on the other side of the mirror when he's gazing at us, I think he would say, boy, you look just like me. Every single feature, every single part of everything that you are, I molded, and you look just like me. And so when we really pay attention to what God is really after, when he's looking at us and he's staring at a reflection that he made himself, that he's so proud of no matter what we've done with the quality of his creation. All he does is he looks at us and he sees himself where we look at him and we see the opposite. But the very thing that God does when he calls us by name is he changes our direction. He changes our perception. That's the first thing he does. He has to turn us around so we can stop focusing on what we're missing and we can pay attention to him, which is everything that we need. And once we begin to put our focus on who God really is, the first thing that he does is he tells us what we created for. He tells us what our purpose is. He tells us what our destiny is. And after we hear all those instructions and information, because we're still bound by everything that the world has told us and that we've grown up hearing from people around us and that we've even attached our names to, it's hard for us to believe that he made us for what he has identified. And so I believe if all of us were to hear what God really created us for, and it would be so beyond your imagination, something you never thought you could accomplish in yourself, I think the first question we would say, well, God, how do I do this? I mean, why would you choose me? And of all people, who am I? We would say to God, who is sure of every single detail about us, God, who am I? That's the one question we would want to know from our Creator, our Maker, our Father. And God says, I am. Now that sounds like a pretty mysterious response when God could give you so many things that he could define you as, but he says, I am. But the reason why God says I am is because when we repeat it back to ourselves, we begin to have this understanding that we are everything that he is. That despite our broken moments, despite our failures, despite our imperfections, despite everything that makes us believe that we are not intact, that we are not identified, that we are not a person of purpose, God says everything that you believe that you're not, you really are everything that I believe that you are. So when God says I am, he says it for us to repeat back to him the very thing that we are, and we are everything that he is. So when we look at ourselves and we say we're broken, God says you're healed. And when we look at us and we say we're incomplete, God says you're finished. And when we look at ourselves and we say, God, but I'm so empty, God says you're fulfilled. God doesn't just pay attention to the things that don't look like him, but he's more concerned with the attributes that still remain, that are his identical presence, that his identical face on us. So the whole purpose of going back to the moments when we travel back down memory lane and we begin to fill in those details and we say, God, who was I in that moment? Why was I broken? Why did I make these bad decisions? Why did I not overcome this? Why did I not have the strength to endure this? Why did I go so long just leaving this unsettled in my life? And see, when you go back with God and you begin to understand that you are identified through Him, and when He looks at those moments with you, He doesn't say you're broken. He says you're healed. And He doesn't look at those moments and say you're unfulfilled. He says you're fulfilled. And He doesn't look at your moments and say that you're empty. He says, I consume you. Because everything that I am, you are. And so now we can go back into our past and begin to define them because we've received our identity through an eternal Creator. And because He's eternal, we never can lose or detach ourselves from who we truly are. It can be smeared, it can be blurred, it can be distorted. But our identity is always alive because it is a part of a living God that never ceases. And so I hope this reflection was able to assist and help you in the places where you have yet to find closure, in the places that you have yet to overcome because you have put up this false security of identity. But until you know that until you are identified by the very thing that you were made by, you'll never be able to fully embrace what you were created to be and do. So the moment that you are able to repeat what God says to you, when you ask God, who am I? He says, I am. His only purpose is for you to understand that you are everything that He is as well.